These interference patterns that emerge as new patterns are, of course, completely illusory in a way. They're entirely to do with our perception. Nothing new has actually been created here except in our mind, in our visual sensorium, if you like. It occurred to me that interference patterns, which is what's going on here and what's going on here when these two pendulums interfere with each other, are really an expression of complexity and of synergy as well, in that something much, much more happens than you expect. These two simple things put together produce something quite beyond your prediction. Now, this is what I was sort of counting on to happen in music. I hope it did. The other thing about discrete music, making a music that was not only infinitely long, which is to say it constantly changed in time, but also that a music that could be different at any point in space. So I had this fantasy then about making a music with lots of loudspeakers in different places, which had different signals in them. Not just stereo mixers, but quite different signals. So, you know, one speaker there would have only that sound in it, that one up there would have only that sound. And therefore, where you stood in the room changed what you heard. I started off by simply putting a different sound source in each corner of the room, and then dedicating specific sounds to those. I used these tiny little, what used to be called ghetto blasters, but which I'm sure are now called disenfranchised neighborhood radios. So I loved these little machines. I still do love them, actually. You could make a CD for each one, and each one played as it played. And the beautiful thing is you didn't have to synchronize them. The whole point was that they weren't synchronized. I often would have a dozen or so of these players. Once in the room, they make a fantastic feeling. It is like being in a place. You know, I was so fed up with the idea that music was something you listened to as though it was on a flat screen. You'd sit in front of two loudspeakers. I just didn't want to be in two-dimensional music land any longer. So this really was an attempt to start using space. And of course, that's what installations are about. You know, installations are about creating spaces that people go to. So the question is, what is new about this kind of music? Well, in a sense, nothing is, because every idea here has been probably hinted at by somebody else beforehand. But what those ideas are, one of the key ideas is the notion of making a piece of music that doesn't exist in anybody's mind before it makes itself. The idea of making music that constantly changes form. So that's a sort of different notion of a composer. Usually we think of a composer as someone who thinks of music in detail, who plans the music out in all its details, like we imagine an architect plans a building. This doesn't work like that. This is more like gardening. This is more like taking a number of musical seeds, planting them, and then letting them come up. And each time that garden grows, it's a little bit different. And sometimes it can be quite radically different. The second thing I think that's interesting about this is the idea of desynchronization or asynchronicity, or whatever it might be called. If you think about the history of music, it's nearly always been about things being tied together. Look at a score, for example. You have the bar lines and everybody's following the bars, everyone's in the same bar at the same time. And there's a pulse, and essentially the music proceeds lockstep together like that. This doesn't do that. This music gathers its whole identity from having a number of parallel channels that are not connected with each other, and it doesn't matter where anybody starts, because the piece is actually made from that disconnectedness, from that asynchronicity. And the third thing I'd say about it is that this is really the realization of a paradox that haunted me as a kid, which was that I wanted to both be a painter and a musician. I was at art school for 5 years, and I remember having this big crisis about, should I do music or should I do art? It bugged me the whole way through art school, and I did both at art school. And then I left and joined a band, as many art students do. But I didn't stop the other stuff. And gradually I started to find that they were starting to draw together. I was making music that was so still that it was more like painting than music. And I was quite deliberately that. I wanted to make music that occupied a space, but didn't particularly do anything. Well, it was there. So music like a condition of the light or a condition of the air or like climate, something like that. Not music like a story, like an adventure. I remember this thing that Robert Rauschenberg, the painter, said once. He said, I want art to be the kind of adventure I like walking down the street. And that was pretty much what I felt, except that because I was a rural boy from Suffolk, my walking down the street was sitting by a river. I wanted to make music that felt like sitting by a river. So there's a sort of constant process going on, which is constantly changing, but within certain limits. You know, the river doesn't suddenly turn tangerine orange, or it doesn't suddenly freeze. It keeps rolling and it keeps changing. So I was interested in this level of change, I guess. The other important thing as a listener is that because the music never repeats, you have to sort of get used to that idea that you are never going to hear it again. Now, this is even truer with the installations that people often say, oh, it's fantastic, that bit. When's that going to come around again? And you say, well, probably never, because the installations now are effectively billion-year-long loops. And they're not even loops, actually, but it'll probably take that long for them to repeat. So at first, people find that quite frustrating because they're looking at something and they realize it's going away. They like it, but it's not going to be there forever. It's a sort of change of mind when you start to let it go, when you say, it's beautiful, I adore it, and it's gone now. This very slow rate of change is seductive. What I think this work is doing, offering a safe space for a kind of, not trance-like, but a kind of waking calmness. And as I say, when people get a chance to do it, they seem to really enjoy doing it. They do it for a long time. I think something else is going on as well, which is that when you're seeing one of these shows in action, you start to realize quite quickly how it works, how the music works and how the pieces work. And you start to realize that this little thing I showed you here with the pendulum, this process of permutation and combination that I've described here, actually does generate variety. And it starts to give you different feelings about how things come into being. Now, that's a very important thing to understand, because we are told, we have all actually been indoctrinated in a certain set of theories about how things are organized and how things are governed. We all believe in top-down. We've been told from our childhood that top-down is how things work. Somebody clever at the top tells all these less clever people what to do. You know, that's the model of the orchestra, for example. It's the model of the army. It's the model of the church. It's the model of traditional organizations, this pyramid. The most exciting thing about the theory of evolution for me is that it inverts that. It says that isn't actually how things come into being. Things come into being from the bottom up. And I think trying to understand that and trying to internalize that as an intuition is politically the most important idea we can have.